I suppose translation has always been my interest in one way or another. When I was in secondary school, I actually was a science student, so I studied physics, computer, and all sorts of things like that. But I always know that my first interest, my main choice, will be something to do with languages. And in my final year in secondary school, I think, I was in an English debate society, and I was helping my classmates actually to translate all the Chinese materials they find into English. So I know that I can do the job. I knew that I can do the job. And I think I want to do more about it. So when I was choosing what I wanted to study in a university, translation was my first choice. My first translation, I think, was Tang Jian's 我想要但我不能 is a short poem by the New Taiwan poet, and is one of the first projects that I handled for renditions at that time. Eva, that is Eva Hong, the editor of renditions at that time, prepared a pile of poems that she wanted to get translated into English, and I'll just pick this one because it looks manageable at least, and it sounds right to me basically. So that was actually the very first poem that I translated and published. Translation, well, as I was saying, that translation has always been an important part of me, and with this very first poem that I translated, I think both Eva and I agree that we can do more of this sort, and what takes to handle it, and I myself found it a fascinating process. So that's how it goes from there, basically. I would say my home is Hong Kong. There's no question about it. I was born and bred here. I haven't really lived for a long period of time anywhere else. So I would say my identity is very much what Hong Kong person was brought up in the 1970s and 80s. My cultural background, I would say, is very much a cultural hybrid, if not linguistic, because I find myself actually more comfortable writing in English than in Chinese. Even when I studied translation, I was fairly comfortable translating from Chinese into English. I would say more so than translating from English into Chinese. And when I have to write something on my own, I probably more comfortably write those things in English as well. So that's what it's like for me. For me, Hong Kong literature is also a very interesting or fascinating hybrid of some of everything. And I think that's what makes Hong Kong itself interesting. It has a long tradition of Chinese writing from writers, especially those 南来作家, those mainland writers who came to Hong Kong in the 60s, 70s, who helped build the scene in Hong Kong, literary scene in Hong Kong. We have people who are educated overseas who came back writing Chinese, and of course there is always an influence of Taiwan writers as well. Many of the Hong Kong writers actually first published their work in Taiwan. So there is some of everything, and a great variety of all different sort of writers and writings, which make things most interesting. I would say my first choice will be Xixi Sai. When I first read her work, I didn't like it. It was an essay that I had to read in secondary school, so it's a textbook passage. But after I actually get to know her work more, I find it absolutely amazing with the variety of things that she has written and has kept on writing all these years. She always strikes me as someone with a very active imagination, but yet the message or even the story in itself is still very much grounded in our everyday life, very much relevant to everyone. So that's the second, I think, maybe somewhat not an obvious choice for others, but I would say is Li Qizhi Lokesi. She's I translated one of her short stories into English for renditions. Was one of my first lengthy translation, I would say, and I got to read everything she's written, or everything she's published over the years. She's actually. She actually came from Hong Kong, but she has migrated to France for many years and has lived her life there now. I find her work very much. It has a very strong local Hong Kong flavor, even when she's been living overseas for so many years. And yet there are also stories not based in Hong Kong, but based in different parts of the world, based in maybe France, somewhere in Europe. So there's a great variety, a great variety of things, especially her short stories and essays. I loved all of them. And the third one, I suppose it might be Gu Changwu. Gu Chang, he's a poet and Hong Kong poet and essay writer. And I also translated a couple of his essays and short poems into English some years ago. And I got to know the guy. I know him when I was in Hong Kong U studying for my master's degree. He was doing his PhD there, so we got in touch with each other. And then I was his assistant along with another supervisor of mine. And we was working on a Kunqu project, the Kun opera project, and we translated some of the literary works or theoretical work on Kunqu singing. And so one of his work that I particularly like is a very small volume called 祖父的改造, 祖父的大载. It consists of a whole bunch of very short essays or anecdotes with his memories of his hometown, his old family, relatives, and so on, and how his life was there in southern China, how he grew up there in the 40s and 50s. Yes, that's three I can think of offhand, I would say. Renditions was founded by George Gao and Stephen Soon in 1973, I think. Well, I actually did some research about George Gao many years ago, so I came to know him before I actually worked for renditions. According to him, it was a project, a pet project that he had in mind when he was visiting Hong Kong as visiting scholars or visiting fellows for the Chinese University in the early 70s. In its magazine that specializes in translation of Chinese literature into English from all historical period, with all genres and everything. So I think it's one of the unique presence at that time in the literary translation scene, even though there are other journals that also focused on translations from Chinese into English. I think Renditions was the only one that handles the whole historical period from Shi Jing up to the very present, and with regardless of where the work originated from, as long as it's written in Chinese, it's a piece of literature, and it's translated from Chinese into English, it's within the scope of renditions. As I was saying, when I was studying for my master's, my thesis was on George Gao, actually. Not on his translation from Chinese into English, or not on renditions itself, but on his translation of American literature from English into Chinese. But of course, my research touched upon all part of his career, and I get to know renditions itself fairly well, and about how it came into being. We talked about when I had traveled to the States to interview him. We talked about all sorts of things related or unrelated to renditions. And my supervisor at that time was Diana Yu, Yudan Lucy. She was actually the very first managing editor for renditions. So I think it was only natural that I grew so very interested in this magazine itself. And when I see a job notice for research assistants and assistant editor of renditions that came up when I was actually looking for a job after my master's degree, I basically jumped, and luckily I got a job. Well, it really depends, because we also rely very much on unsolicited manuscript that arrived on its own. But if we are thinking of a particular theme that we want to work on, sometimes we also commission translations. And the criteria is always that it has to be a piece of good literature in Chinese, regardless of who writes this and when, but it has to be a good piece of literature in Chinese, and it can be translated into English. And when we're picking on different English translations that we received, the main criteria again is that it has to work as a piece of literature in English. The translation has to read well, but also at the same time faithful to the Chinese text. I think we're one of the very few literary journals that actually edit fairly fairly detailed way. And when we're editing the work, we actually ask our contributors to supply us with the original Chinese text as well. So in addition to general English literary editings that any literary journals might also be doing, we will check it against the Chinese original text to make sure that is good representation of the Chinese work. I probably can't think of anything that I'm particularly proud of, really. But there is a work, maybe, that I found it particularly interesting, and it's one of my very first lengthy translation, a short story, as I mentioned before, a short story by Lucchesi. It is a short story about the migration issue in Hong Kong in the 80s and 90s. The main protagonist of the story is an old granny whose sons and daughters were all spread all over the world. They have migrated to almost every part of the world, and when she had to visit sons and daughters, she had to travel by plane, as the title of the story is 洪钟阿婆, that is, I translated that as Air Granny. Within the story, there's one pun that appears throughout the whole story. It's in print, it's like A 逼他气死了，就是 that is A, B, C. It appeared in the Chinese text like that. A, and then B, 他气死了, and then C, 气死了. So it's not easy to translate that into English, and I think I did what I can, and basically that's the first thing that I considered whether I can handle this before I decided to translate the story. And I came up with the solution. It's not the 100% ideal solution, but I think I sort of make it work, and it's also one of the very first translation hurdle that I thought I managed to overcome. So this is kind of the if I had to pick a proud moment, maybe that's the first taste of it, I would say, and that's always, as I said, that's what makes translation fascinating. I would say it is like translating anything. There are always things that may not be readily translatable, and with Hong Kong literature, even though we are very much influenced by Western way of life, there are still things which are pretty Chinese or pretty grounded in Chinese tradition that are not readily translatable in English. So that's one of the things that always is one of the things that a translator will have to overcome in one way or another: cultural issues and cultural differences and how to handle it. And I think with this whole variety of Hong Kong culture, there are aspects of different works that there are always things that are not easy to handle and to translate. And it's not just the linguistic aspect, how to present it in the English language, but whether the cultural impact behind it can also be conveyed to the English reader. Well, as I was saying, one of the criteria for renditions to decide whether a work is accepted for publication is that the piece of translation itself has to work as a piece of English literature in English. I mean, as a piece of literature in English. So it has to be translated in idiomatic English language, no question about that. And then the issues behind it, the stories behind it, it has to be conveyed in one way or another to an English reader, to make sense to an English reader. And so that's what we always will focus on when we are editing the work. I would say that the translator is, in a way, I wouldn't say a translator is a conduit that's invisible, that simply is not right. But I would say the translator is trying to convey what he or she understand of the author's intention to make sense to the target reader of the translation. So the translation plays a central role in the translation process itself. He or she has to understand clearly what the author is trying to say, or has as a valid interpretation of what the author is trying to say, and then to convey it in idiomatic English for an English readership who may not necessarily have knowledge in finer points of the Chinese culture in them, so to make that make sense and understandable to them is another piece of the puzzle that we have to solve. It depends on whether the writer is alive and reachable. And usually it's not us as editor who contact the renditions as an editor to contact the writer ourselves, unless we are looking for the copyright permission. But as a translator, I usually try to reach out to the author if possible. And I did in some cases. One of my latest translation is Wu Xubin's short story 牛鳥。Wu Xubin 係吳許斌。So I actually got to meet her quite a few times, because I'm not just translating that particular story. I'm also responsible for getting the whole story collection translated. So I farmed out other stories to other translators, and I was like the editor of that volume that came out in English. So I actually meet up with the author quite a few times. The first time is with other local translators who were available in Hong Kong, and we sit down in the coffee shop and we discuss different things about the work, or different stories, different things that other translators have problems or want her opinion about, and afterwards I also meet up with her again alone a few times. So we discuss different issues of the stories, and since she reads English with no problems, she has lived in the States for, I think in the States, or is it in Vancouver? Anyway, she studied in the States at least for a few years. She has no problem reading English, so she actually read the first proof that I translated and got laid out and she also gave me feedbacks. So that's one of the work that I actually worked closest with the authors with. With other things, I may not. With other stories, I might still contact the author in some way, telling him or her that I'm translating it and so on. But I might not discuss every single thing that I came across, or it might not be such in-depth exchange. To Pierce the Material Screen is actually Eva's last pet project before she left Renditions. So this is one of the things that she has her mind on for many years. She wants to have an anthology of Hong Kong writings translated into English. So what I did was to help her identify works that can be included in the volume. There are works that she has a strong opinion about and she wants absolutely to include, no problem. But there might be a few authors that she thought should have a presence in the book, but she has not decided on which of his or her works to get included. And so I either help her dig up the works of that particular authors and make recommendations, or maybe she has one or two works in mind from that particular author and she wants my opinion about A, whether that's worthwhile, or B, if it's like 2 or 3 stories or 2 or 3 essays, which one would I pick if I have to? So that's basically my role in it, in the selection of the pieces to translate. And obviously, as assistant editor as well as editor assistant, or I think I was assistant editor of Renditions at that time. I had to went through all the proofs, different stages of the edited manuscript, the proofs, and I have to contact the contributors if they are not translated in-house. I mean, most of the work are translated by, are farmed out to other translators, commissioned to them. So I got in touch with, sometimes it's me or sometimes it's Eva who has to get in touch with the translators and follow up with different stages of the edited manuscript and the proof. And since Eva was living most of her time in the UK in the last stage of the preparation of this book, I basically was the one who coordinate things, to help coordinate things in Hong Kong, and of course I keep in regular, frequent contact with her by email or sometimes when she came to Hong Kong, we talk in details and so on. I would say yes, because especially for Renditions, my first experience as editor is at Renditions, and I basically got full-time on-the-job training under Eva. So with Renditions, obviously translation is a key to it. And what's interesting as an editor of Renditions is that whenever there are problems in the translator's work, usually it's something that extremely difficult to translate, or something that is a problem in translation in one way or another. But as an editor, you have no way to just look the other way. You know the problem exists, and you have to came up with suggestions to the author, and explain to the authors why, or not the author, explain to the contributors why we think his or her original translation might not work. So you have to justify the changes that you make. You have to come up with a valid alternative, and you have to convince the author that your suggestions actually work better than his or her original attempt, and to justify the reason for the changes and for the suggested changes and so on. So it gets you to really think about the translation process and what you want to achieve in translation, and why it's important, what's important in that particular piece of work, and what's particular important in the translation process that you want to do what it takes to preserve, even though you might have to sacrifice other elements, because it's not a 100% translation. It doesn't always happen. The word is not perfect, and translation is not perfect either. But you have to make a choice, and you have to justify why. So you get to think about all these issues. And this exchange with the translator, a lot of them are very experienced translators, a lot more experienced than I was at that time, at least. Very well known, very experienced, some of the tip top, I would say, in the industry. And so I got to actually learn a lot during the experience. Well, I would say my experience of the 9 years or almost 10 years at renditions, and then a few more years at the Hong Kong U Press and as a full-time editor. So I am fairly comfortable editing different type of texts, especially literary or academic texts, bilingually, whether in Chinese or in English, or whether it involves elements of translation in it. During my years as an editor of renditions and editor as a Hong Kong U Press, I also came to understand the problems of the limited number of people who actually devoted the time doing this sort of thing, and who are actually good at this sort of things. It's extremely difficult to find a good editor, bilingual editor for academic or literary texts. So I thought I could do it, and I can make a contribution this way, and actually make a living this way. So that's what I decided to do after I left my full-time employment.